Hello, today is Good Friday, the most solemn day of the Christian year. I'm offering this as a reflection on the events of today from the perspective of one of the characters of the story, Nicodemus, who is one of the rulers of the Jews. He's a member of the Jewish council and he's encountered Jesus earlier on in his ministry and now encounters him at the cross. I'm going to put this into context by reading part of St. John's Gospel, chapter 19, and then we will focus on Nicodemus and his story. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to the place called the place of a skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews came to Pilate and said, "Do not write, 'This man, the King of the Jews,' but this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says, "They divided my clothes among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from this hour the disciple took her into his own home. Now after this, when Jesus knew that all was finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had finished the wine, he said, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, the Jews did not want their bodies on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because that Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and their bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with Jesus. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, and they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once came blood and water. He who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. These things occurred so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. None of his bones shall be broken. And again, another passage of scripture says, "They will look on the one whom they have pierced." After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of the fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission, so that he came and removed the body. Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it in spices, in linen cloths, according to the custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. And so Nicodemus' story. Looking back over it, it all seemed to happen at night, at least the most significant things. It was at night, quite early on in Jesus' ministry, that Nicodemus had first met him. Nicodemus had, of course, first heard of him some time before, but then, as a member of the Jewish council, you would have expected it. It wouldn't have been any different. In fact, they had been keeping a watch on Jesus from the very beginning. Jesus was doing things and was stirring up feelings, and so they had to do something. He simply couldn't be left alone, and the council had a very effective spy network that reported back anything out of the ordinary. And what was going on with Jesus was truly extraordinary. Now, for people who are supposed to be religious, the priests were certainly very unhappy about the sort of religion that Jesus represented. Religion for the priests was something that they did. People came to them to offer sacrifices, most of all for the annual ritual of atonement, where the sins of the whole nations were wiped away for another day. But on other occasions they came as well. They came to the priests for judgment on the interpretation of the law. In fact, unless the priests did it, it simply wasn't religion as far as they were concerned. And the priests, of course, hated these newfangled synagogues that were springing up all over the place, because despite the fact that the people who called themselves rabbis insisted that they were simply religious schools, the priests said they knew better, and they felt threatened by them as by nothing else. Nothing else, that is, until Jesus came on the scene. And now they were frightened indeed, and they convened the religious council to discuss him. Nicodemus remembered that stormy meeting to which he was summoned as an expert on the Jewish law, even though he was a Pharisee and not a priest himself. And what he heard astonished him. Some of them were for having him assassinated there and then, but others felt that Jesus hadn't done anything wrong, at least not yet, and until he did, they could do nothing. But the reports that suggested that he was changing the lives of ordinary people, and that here God's Spirit was indeed at work after centuries without a prophet, these reports intrigued Nicodemus. He even suggested that one of their own number should go and talk to Jesus, but she was shouted down. "If you do that," they said, "he'll be on to us." But the more he thought about it, the more Nicodemus realized that he was being almost condemned to go and see Jesus. And so it was that one night he found himself outside Jesus' lodgings. Nicodemus always regretted the cloak and dagger aspects of this meeting with Jesus. He would much have preferred to meet him in the open, where people could see, but no, it had to be at night, just in case. When Nicodemus finally met him, he felt humbled. This was somebody about whom he had heard so much, about whom so many people were so very frightened. But the Jesus he met was so totally different from his expectations that he found himself saying, "Rabbi, we know that God sent you because no one can do what you're doing unless he comes from God." And suddenly he knew that this was true, that Jesus did indeed come from God, and that the power of God was truly at work in him. But Jesus staggered Nicodemus. "Unless you're born again," he said, "you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." It was as if Jesus had seen right into Nicodemus' heart, had seen his secret longings, his longing to truly follow God and to leave behind the trappings of power that being in the Jewish council brought him. And in their conversation, Jesus explained that being born again meant being open to the Spirit of God. And he said he was surprised that he should have to explain this to a member of the council. So strong was the effect of Jesus' words on Nicodemus that there and then his life was turned around, and he became one of Jesus' followers, although he still had to act secretly, since he remained a member, although a reluctant one, of the council. As time went by, Nicodemus found that his position was more and more difficult, because reports were being brought to the council, and each one made the priests and the other members of the council even more worried. "Who on earth is this man?" they kept asking. But Nicodemus would smile to himself. "Don't look to the earth," he'd think to himself. "Look to heaven if you want to know really who he is." That final week, however, things were different. The council met every day until by the end of the week it was in permanent session. They realized how lucky they had been when Jesus had entered Jerusalem and when he had simply cleansed the temple. The priests muttered a bit about the mess, but that was about it, really. The whole thing could have turned into a full-scale insurrection, and the Romans, who were always edgy about large crowds of people, had been watching anxiously. And if the Romans stepped in, then who knew what would happen? No, they knew they had been lucky, but something had to be done. And so during the week they had devised questions to ask Jesus, things to trick him, so that his answer would either cause offence to them or one of their groups, or to the Romans or to the crowds. But he was simply too clever for them, and every time someone reported back, Nicodemus had to smile at their anger and frustration, chuckling almost out loud when he heard Jesus' response to the question about whether it was lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not. They had thought long and hard about that question, but nobody expected Jesus to ask for the coin, which, being a graven image, was not theoretically allowed in the temple, but one had been brought nonetheless. Whose image and likeness is this? He asked. The emperor's, they replied. Well, if it belongs to the emperor, then give it back to the emperor, but give to God the things that are due to him too. People had been amazed. Some people had laughed. And despite the council's fury, the atmosphere around Jesus was almost like a carnival, at least at first. But then the mood changed, subtly at first. The Passover was coming and there were more people arriving in Jerusalem all the time. But since these fresh crowds hadn't been there at the beginning of the week, and though there was a bit of curiosity about Jesus, people began to lose interest. Until finally, after a few days, one of his own people came to the council and agreed to sell him to them. Nicodemus, of course, tried to warn Jesus, but the message simply hadn't got through. Before he knew it, Jesus was there before them, answering questions. Well, or at least not answering questions. However, finally, in exasperation, the high priest asked him, "So, are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" And Jesus stood there and said, "I am." And he invoked the sacred name of God, "I am," given once and for all to Moses at the burning bush. And that was the end of it. The high priest, more in relief than anything else, tore his robe, and Jesus was taken away to Pilate. The next time Nicodemus saw Jesus was a time that he would never forget. Jesus was already hanging on the cross when the counsel to a man was taken out to see their work. And there he was in front of them, naked, bloodied, bruised. Nicodemus barely recognized him. Half a thorn bush had been jammed onto his head, and above him, plain for all to see, was the inscription, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." "The boss wasn't very happy with those words," whispered the man next to him, "but Pilate just wouldn't change them." Members of the Jewish council were expected to jeer at Jesus, and they didn't disappoint. "Come down now from the cross," they shouted, "and then we'll believe in you." But a lot of them were silent and just looked at him. Most of them didn't stay long. They had had their way. And anyway, the priests themselves didn't want to be around him when he died, just in case they were ritually unclean for the Passover. So they soon left him alone. Some friends stood around. In front of the crowd, Nicodemus spotted an old friend, Joseph of Arimathea, and they found themselves standing together, watching the final agonies of the man that they thought would be the Messiah. "Did you know him?" asked Joseph. "Yes," said Nicodemus. "I hoped that he was the one we'd be waiting for." Yes, said Joseph, so did I. Were we wrong, do you think? We'll have to wait and see, Joseph replied. But nothing happened. No angels appeared. There was no miracle. Just the slow ebbing away of life. Each breath, pain beyond measure. And around him, as Jesus died, Nicodemus could feel growing darkness. And he remembered that night when he had first met him, when his life had been changed, just as it was being changed now. Darkness, night. Until finally it was over. Jesus had yelled one last time, in a cry that sounded almost like triumph, with words in the cry that may have been, "It is finished." And then it was over. The Roman soldier's professionals always got on with their work. The council had asked that there should be no bodies defiling the city before the Passover, so that they made sure that Jesus and the others were properly dead. In the case of Jesus, they rammed the head of a spear up through his ribs and into his body. There was no doubt about it. He was dead, and they got on with getting the bodies down. What do they do now? Asked Nicodemus. They just throw the bodies in a pit, I think. They can't do that. Nicodemus was horrified. Well, said Joseph slowly, I've had permission. There's always my grave over there as well. And he gestured to a garden only a few dozen yards away. I bought it a few years ago. It's never been used. We'll take him there. And so it was that they laid him in the tomb, those two old Jewish men working together against the coming of the night. We'll have to come back on Sunday, Joseph said sadly as they walked away. Yes, said Nicodemus. Until Sunday.